morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. 4 days before its deadline, the Congressional Supercommittee on Reducing America's Debt remains at an impasse. Democrats yesterday openly ridiculed the latest proposals from Republicans. And the New York Times reports today that unreleased census figures show that 100 million Americans, that is 1 in 3 of us, live below or only just above the poverty line. Right now, I'm joined by my panel, James Polis, columnist for thedailycaller.com, who has also written for The American Conservative, Michelle Goldberg, senior contributing writer to Newsweek and The Daily Beast, from GritTV.org, Laura Flanders, co-author and editor of At the Tea Party, and Ray Lewis, retired Philadelphia police captain, who was arrested at Occupy Wall Street on the National Day of Action on Thursday. And for those tuning in for the one and only Melissa Harris Perry, do not worry, she will be joining us in just a bit. All right, if the first 2 months of Occupy Wall Street featured the Rebel Alliance making surprising gains, I think it's fair to say this past week was when the empire struck back. On Tuesday, Mayor Bloomberg ordered police in riot gear to clear the occupiers out of Zuccotti Park in an early morning raid. Police destroyed the occupiers' personal belongings, including 5,500 or so books in the People's Library on site. One city councilman, Ydanis Rodriguez, was thrown to the ground, beaten, and arrested at the scene. Mayor Bloomberg and police made sure it was all done away from the prying eyes of the press, who were blocked from Zuccotti Park, supposedly for their own safety, according to the city. Then on Thursday, protesters organized a day of action to mark the 2-month anniversary of the Occupy movement, a protest known on Twitter as #N17. 1,000 protesters gathered near New York Stock Exchange in an almost entirely nonviolent demonstration. There were, however, a few exceptions. 7 officers and 10 protesters were injured, according to police. Thursday night, thousands marched over the Brooklyn Bridge in a peaceful protest, and I was there. I'll talk more about that later. Also Thursday, there were protests and arrests in Los Angeles, St. Louis, Portland, Oregon, and other cities around the country. More than 300 arrested Thursday, 252 in New York City alone. Captain Lewis, you were arrested, charged with disorderly conduct, including disrupting traffic and refusing to move on. There was an image of you being arrested in your dress blues down in front of the New York Stock Exchange that went kind of viral, and we were all in the office sort of marveling at it. There's some footage of you being arrested. Why did you're a retired police captain, you're served in Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken, right? Mm-hmm. Why did you come down to Occupy Wall Street on Thursday?
Well, I didn't come down on Thursday. I actually came down on Monday. And I came down to assist the movement because, to me, I've been retired for 8 years in a very secluded life. I moved up to New York, Catskill Mountains, and you can't see anybody, nobody can see me. And it was a Walden Pond type of lifestyle, which I wanted. But I also use the internet for my only source of information, not the TV, not the newspapers. And I saw this action being taken by these protesters and the conditions they were living in and the fact that they were not doing this for themselves. They were doing this for all people who were suffering injustice. And that conviction that they had for social justice just inspired me, and I couldn't do anything else but come down. And I would have been down sooner, but I was working on a very important project in upstate New York against the gas companies. The term is fracking, where they go down and they destroy the
You're
earth.
Involved in fracking activism upstate. So you came down this week. Will you tell me about the arrest itself? And I guess the question I'm sort of dying to know is what your interactions with New York NYPD was like. Presumably it was a little different than if I had been down there arrested or someone else. Obviously you were dressed like this. What was that interaction like?
They were it was exemplary of professional conduct with me and every protester that I witnessed.
Interesting.
They had an extremely tough job. They're human beings too, okay? And there's the fight or flight reaction.
Interesting.
Police cannot have the flight reaction, so they have to have the fight. And subsequently, this can get out of hand. And that's why you have the white shirts. The white shirts are the ones who are supervising. What I saw down there was the white shirts doing fighting. Therefore, who's supervising?
Right.
That's when you have anarchy. And The problem, and I also want to make clear to everyone in the New York Police Department that my statements, video was edited, okay? And I knew that was going to happen. And the one step I could take to try to minimize that from happening was to refuse any interviews with Fox News. And a Fox representative did come up to me. I saw the Fox. I said, "You stay away from me. You're a big part of the problem." But go ahead, continue. I'm a little wordy. If I get too wordy,
no, you're not wordy. You're perfect. I mean, this is really fascinating stuff because I think all of us have been. I'll speak for myself. I've been watching this unfold, and in the beginning. I think I've been surprised by some of the police overreaction. And people on the internet have said, you're naive to be surprised by police overreaction. But I think there's part of me that feels that, I'm worried about confrontations with police becoming the sort of signpost for the movement as opposed to its content about the 99% message. At the same time, I have been really upset by the various police overreactions we've seen across the country, and it seems consistent. I mean, you have seen time and time again non-threatening, non-violent, peaceful protesters being the subject of force, batons, pepper spray. I want to play this video, which is sort of making the rounds this morning now. This is students at UC California, Davis, sitting down completely peacefully, linked arms, protesting tuition hikes, and this is what happens to them. Person who emailed that to me this morning said it looked like someone spraying cockroaches. That was pepper spray. What is your reaction when you see a video like that?
My reaction is corporate America is using their own police department as hired thugs, and that's a disgrace. And I also want to explain, I have to get a few things in here on my own.
Please.
I was holding a sign that said, NYPD, do not be Wall Street mercenaries. It was misinterpreted. Okay, what I found out, and they'll never see that sign again for this reason. I was trying to convey the message, do not become Wall Street mercenaries. But just that one word, do not be, instead of become, it was like I was alluding to the fact that they already are mercenaries. And that, I didn't realize that until I was told.
And did you get a lot of backlash to that?
No, but I got one person that told me that, and then a light bulb went on my head, and I said, you know what? He's absolutely right. I was inferring that they're mercenaries now, and that is not the case. So I apologize to every NYPD officer out there if you interpreted it the wrong way.
But you seem to have this very conflicted stance on what is happening between the protesters and police, and I understand that given your unique positionality, which is why we invited you on the program. You are both a protester and a retired police officer. I don't think there's a whole lot of people in that part of the Venn diagram as of yet. In Wisconsin, when we saw in Wisconsin, when there was the move to destroy collective bargaining by Governor Scott Walker, we saw police standing in solidarity with protesters, and it was a very powerful image. And I don't think we're seeing a lot of that so far. I want you to go back to this psychology of fight or flight. Describe to me what is in your head as a police officer as you stand there facing people linked arms or sort of confronting you in a nonviolent way. What is the psychology of that moment like?
Okay. You are being confronted oftentimes in a nonviolent way, but sometimes there's more violence coming from the demonstrators than you see. All right, and there's a tremendous amount of hostility being thrown your way, disparaging remarks against your mother, your parents, everything like that, being spit upon, and you have to just stand there and take a lot of that. We're all human, okay? Cops are just as human as everybody else. And some of them are going to lose their temper. Everybody has lost their temper. And that is the reason you have to have supervision. And that's why the white shirts cannot get involved in fighting, because then it's anarchy. There's nobody supervising them.
Their role in the hierarchy is to be the check on that moment when you lose your...
Exactly.
And that is not what we've seen.
Exactly.
Laura,
it's so important. You have said so many important things, and thank you so much for being here. First, I want to just remind you and all of us where you started, which was you were drawn to this movement because of the values it was expressing.
Right.
And I think that what's been so critical about this week is that we've had an effort to shift the profile of what this movement is about. You can change any picture. Maybe you can't change the Occupy movement, but you can certainly change the picture by pouring enormous amounts of cops into every television frame.
Right.
And that's what happened this week. But what's motivating people to come to this movement is not that it's a police versus the people conflict. It is because of the values that are being represented here, which I think really were expressed this week as the 99% for the 100%. And then the other thing that you talked about that I think is just a little fact is with this question of mercenaries, there was some important reporting over the last few weeks about how, in fact, I think Pam Martins wrote about it for Counterpunch, you have got a Giuliani program. Mayor Giuliani started a program years back called Plan Detail, which it emerges, Wall Street can hire NYPD. Don't pay the benefits, don't pay the pensions. So you weren't entirely wrong, although you're completely right that your words were vulnerable to editing. We saw that this week.
Michelle, you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I mean, you said earlier that you don't want this to become a police versus protester story. But at the same time, one of the things that's been so interesting about this is that the police have actually played such a kind of important catalytic role in this movement since day one. I mean, a lot of people dismissed it early on in September. It's just a bunch of the same kind of the anarchist usual suspects in the park. Then there was that really horrible image of a police officer pepper spraying this woman in the face. Suddenly it got a lot bigger. There was a big march over the Brooklyn Bridge in October, 700 people arrested. Then it really took off. I thought that the movement was really dwindling. Zuccotti Park was becoming increasingly kind of sordid and sketchy. Then they cracked down with such extreme force. And all of a sudden, again, it's reinvigorated. They have their biggest march ever.
Well, but wait. We don't want the movement. I don't think, if I'm coming from where you're coming from, to gain in public view based on the number of arrests that are made. Right. I don't think there's any surprise that the captain feels some ambivalence about the movement. I don't think you have to be a captain to feel that ambivalence. Sure. Given that there is this real tension when it comes to the rule of law breaking down on both sides, where you've got sort of the jackasses versus jackboots. And both sides taunting the other. It's not going to be good. And I really have to ask you, my question is, what are the values? You talk about the values that are being expressed. It's not clear to me that there's any consistency of values that are being expressed.
Laura, I'm going to have you answer that question.
No fighting here.
Laura, I'm going to have you answer that question after the break. Right. Ray Lewis, I'm going to thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful to have you on this morning. We will be back. We're going to talk about the values driving the 99%, and Melissa Harris Perry will join us after the break. MSNBC contributor and my friend Melissa Harris Perry, also a professor of political science at Tulane University. She writes for The Nation. She's now at the table.
Yay!
Awesome. Wow.
Matching the set.
Captain Lewis was great, and I'm so glad that he came by this morning. Props to our booker, Diane Seamus, who used to work for Laura, who tracked him down and got him in here this morning. So we're talking about sort of what has happened at Occupy this week. I was on the Brooklyn Bridge on Thursday night for the final part of the action. And, we were walking around with two of the members of staff. And, I said at one point, this sort of feels a bit like it feels like other marches I've been at. It didn't have this kind of there was something about the Occupy movement that felt distinct and new. And I think that was part of what was driving it. And I was on the bridge and I was like, well, this sort of feels like something I've been at. And then we got up onto the bridge. And we saw at the top of the sort of bridge this projection onto the Verizon building. And someone had figured out, there it is, you can see it, it was this projection, it was like the bat signal. It was against the building, it said, we are the 99%, and it was sort of, we are winning, this is a global uprising, and all these sort of inspiring phrases. And everyone on the bridge sort of cheered. And that moment felt to me like, okay, this is what has been so sort of fascinating and galvanizing about this is the sort of constantly shifting and mutating kind of creative ways of expressing this sentiment that has happened. That it doesn't feel like this sort of staid thing. And it made me think about now that there isn't this single place where the General Assembly could happen in this little society miniature, like what are the next steps?
Well, this is why the media is so important and why I've worked in independent media for so long and you haven't until you got here. Are we going to allow this story to become what you described, which was the image taken away by a lot of people people this week? Or are we going to take our cameras where this movement actually has been? You know, it hasn't just been a presence in the park. It's been a presence at the Board of Ed meetings. It's been a presence at the Brooklyn court where they're auctioning off foreclosed houses. To see Occupy Wall Street people stand up and sing, "Stop the sales.
Right.
We'll find the money.
Right.
Stop the sales." To see people stop houses get foreclosed in Cleveland. Are we going to take our cameras there? Are we going to show the power that this movement has to bring real tools, not just to the 99%, but to the 100%?
Right.
Or are we going to do what the media tend to do, which is follow where the shiny cameras are, the shiny police cars are, and the conflict?
Right.
Because, yes, you have a Bull Connor moment there with that tear gas, with that pepper spray, no question. And it's important that we're on that story. And let's face it, police brutality is part of what has motivated some of the people in this movement, brought some of them into the streets. But that's not what this movement's about. It is not about polarizing with police. And half the time, as the captain said, at the Occupy protests, you have people saying to the police, "We're here for you. We're your daughters. We're your nieces. We're your sisters and brothers. You are part of the 99%. It is not a confrontational movement. It's a consciousness raising.
But it's getting increasingly confrontational. I mean, I think, you know, early on, there was a lot more of that, you know, give the police raises. After the raid, and it's understandable that kind of the anger is building on both sides, but there was a lot more kind of things I'm not allowed to say on television hurled at the police, and also confrontational with actually people on Wall Street. I have kind of mixed feelings about this. You know, when I went, so there was the march on Thursday night, but in the morning there was a kind of much more direct action to shut down Wall Street.
Which is where Captain Lewis was arrested.
People barricading, linking arms to stop people from getting into their buildings, to stop people from crossing intersections. I witnessed this one woman who, you know, kind of had her coffee. She was hurrying to work. The protesters wouldn't let her through, and they said, "Sorry, Wall Street's closed today," and she burst into tears. And they kind of said, well, you know, of course she's not going to get in trouble because she has an excuse. I just thought, you know, her bosses very well could have said, "Get here early today because there's going to be protests," and she didn't make it. Right. And so there was a lot of, I have very mixed feelings about where the movement is going in terms of this kind of more confrontational
I don't think
strategy.
And this speaks to the question of values, right? I mean, is shutting down the Port of Oakland one of the values that Occupy Wall Street or the Occupy movement is expressing? Is shutting down the New York Stock Exchange, right, in the service of the 100%? I think the answer is self-evidently no.
Well, but look,
let's clarify that question. Clarify that question. You're saying shutting down. I mean, to me, shutting down New York Stock Exchange is the most sort of obvious and symbolically potent direct action. I mean, it's different than there was a YouTube video circulating around people.
What, Chris?
Symbolic of the fact that they think this is the locus of a sort of cancerous growth on American society, which is the financial industrial complex, which accounted on the eve of the crash for 40% of corporate profits, an industry that should be at its best essentially a utility, should channel money from savings to investment, should be productive, should not create excess risk and destruction, and that has become something perverse and destructive, and that perversive destructiveness has rendered the society immiserated in the midst of a recession, which has created tremendous amount of unemployment, and that as a response, you need to disrupt the locus of that.
Well, it was...
The Tea Party shut down health care reform, right?
Oh, health care reform is an idea, right?
No, it was a bill. It was a bill, and then it became a law, right?
And they shut down town meetings.
Right. And look, they shut down town meetings, they shut down democratic process, and the fact is that was strategy, right? Do I think that a populist movement, to the extent that the Tea Party, you know, the populist elements of it, that they wanted to shut down democracy? Of course not. But it was a strategy that they used in order to get their voices heard. So do I think that that Occupy doesn't want people to go to work? Obviously not, right? Obviously, Occupy wants people to go to work, but part of the strategy here is going to be. So, what I'm surprised about is why the anxiety with it being confrontational.
Right.
I mean,
I think my anxiety is about being confrontational with the wrong people. Like, I think shutting down the New York Stock Exchange, or if you think about that great action from the late 60s or 70s when they threw dollar bills down on the trading floor and kind of watched everybody scrambled. And to me, that was a very potent image of, and it was really going after the right people. I guess my concern is kind of making enemies out of low-level office workers who don't understand what's going on.
They didn't walk the Brooklyn Bridge. They were very strategic about what they did. For every conversation that you could say you saw on one side, we can say we saw stories on the other side. But this was about a popular check on power.
It is, but the limitation, and I will just suggest this. So I hear what you're saying about media, but a couple of things that organizers always have to remember is that it's not independent media. It's corporate media that drives these things. And so part of strategy, I mean, it certainly was part of civil rights strategy, part of feminist strategy, is to figure out a media strategy, right? And part of the problem of localized action against what is a global issue is that you do end up in physical confrontation with street-level bureaucrats and with mayors and with and those mayors can do anything from co-opting to aggressing, but the fact is you do end up in a like physical confrontation or direct action with folks who aren't quite the people that you're actually.
The faces of Lloyd Blankfein is not the person who is coming out with the batons and pepper spray. Lloyd Blankfein is not. I'm saying the head of Goldman Sachs as an example of the sort of person that Occupy Wall Street would target.
But this was such a day of diverse tactics. I mean, let's face it. You had a day of can we delay the more opening bell that ended with an enormously diverse legal license,
completely peaceful, and the cops actually.
Unions, and then a very theatrical arrest on Brooklyn Bridge, which, let's just say, you had the leader of our fastest growing union, the SEIU, arrested there on the streets. How come that wasn't news?
We're going to talk about the future of Occupy Wall Street and this interesting point that I think we've landed on, which is the sort of inevitably polarizing effect of confrontation, which is part of any movement. I want to get to that right after this.
Congratulations.
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 Today, the city of Charlotte can use Verizon technology to inspire businesses to conserve energy and monitor costs, making communities greener.
Congratulations.
And buildings as valuable to the bottom line as the people inside them.
Congratulations.
Because when you add Verizon to your company, you don't just add, you multiply. Verizon.
Want to achieve more with your money? PNC Virtual Wallet gathers your spending and saving in one place. Credit and debit purchases, checks, bills, and other financial information. It lets you see the details, as well as the big financial picture, so you can do more with your money. See what a complete view of your money can do for you at PNCVirtualWallet.com. PNC Bank, for the achiever in you.
I was fascinated by balsa wood airplanes since I was a kid.
I always wondered, how did an airplane get in the air?
At GE Aviation, we build jet engines. We lift people up off the ground to 35,000 feet. These engines are built by hand with very precise assembly techniques.
It's going to fly people around the world safely and better than it's ever done before.
It would be a real treat to hear this monster fire up.
I think a lot of people, when they look at a jet engine, they see a big hunk of metal. But when I look at it, I see Seth, Mark, Tom, and people like that who work on engines every day.
I would love to see this thing fly. It's a dream, honestly.
There it is.
I want to see that again.
At Aviva, we wonder why other life insurance companies treat you like a policy, not a person. Instead of getting to know you, they simply assign you a number. Aviva is here to change all that. We're bringing humanity back to insurance and putting people before policies. Aviva Life Insurance and Annuities. We are building insurance around you.
My husband, he thinks it's a 3-sheeter. I say 1-sheeter. Bounty can clean the mess with less.
In this lab demo, 1 sheet of Bounty leaves this surface as clean as 2 sheets of the Bargain brand. Dance cooking? Bring it. Super durable, super absorbent, super clean. Bounty, the 1 sheet clean picker-upper. And try Bounty napkins.
They have literally separate tents because of rapes.
Yeah.
We had a murder. There's a plan out I read earlier today that they're literally now trying, there's bomb threats that they're talking about. And the president, Nancy Pelosi, wrapped their arms around this thing.
Now the Democrats, you'd think they'd step away from these demonic loons and teenage runaways, adolescents looking for a cause.
The national lawyers.
Right, funded by George Soros and who's represented people like the Weather Underground.
So some of that money is kind of pouring in, buying these people cocktails or whatever.
Now that these kids from Occupy whatever have gotten used to urinating and defecating in the streets, when they go back home, are their parents going to have to housebreak them all over again?
I will admit that I find Rush Limbaugh incredibly entertaining. That's a sort of a...
He found himself entertaining. Did you see the smile on his
Yes.
face? Like,
he's like, that was a good one.
Yeah.
Housebroken. See what I did there? I wanted to play that because I think that's just a little taste, right, of what's going on in the conservative media about Occupy. And the reason I think that's germane is because we've been talking about the fact that there's sort of two things happening. Direct action movements require conflict. Conflict and confrontation are part of what they are about. Conflict and confrontation are polarizing. The genius in the beginning was this 99% idea, right, which is this massively big tent. But the fact of the matter is American politics are very polarized. And it was only a matter of time that Occupy Wall Street would become polarizing, partly because of confrontation, but partly because this is what is happening in the conservative media. The conservative media has turned full throat against the protesters.
And that was going to happen regardless.
Absolutely.
I mean, there was nothing the protesters could have done to
well,
make that
but
not
it didn't have to happen this way, right? I mean, facts are facts, and they're not making this stuff up whole cloth, right? There are the rape-safe tents, right? There is violence. There is squalor.
There was one. Like in a city, like in New York or D.C. or or Baltimore. I mean, so the idea that that social ills exist in a social space, and that it should not surprise the media. And
so you don't want to hold any of these people personally accountable.
Of course you want to hold them personally accountable.
Of course I would.
That's why they started.
That's a ridiculous overstatement. Of course I would. But part of my concern, I suppose, is, for example, on the anxiety about rape. I typically have a pretty good read on folks who are fundamentally concerned with the question of violence against women. And the reason I have a good read on this is because they report on it regularly. They support policies that would reduce violence against women.
And at the top of that list is Sean Hannity.
Yes, exactly. And so when that happens, my ears always perk up and think, oh, why in this moment do you suddenly have a concern about a set of social ills that you haven't previously expressed?
I think the answer is because Republicans and conservatives have cared about law and order issues for a long time. This is not something new for them.
No, James has a very good thesis on this, which he wrote in the Atlantic, which I thought was interesting this week, about how Occupy basically. That Occupy allows Republicans to find their old-time law and order religion, which has been missing for a long time. I mean, they got as much out of that politically as they could, and they squeezed and they squeezed and they squeezed, and crime went down and down and down. And at a certain point, law and order rhetoric just didn't have the increasing returns.
Well, because
they turned
Clinton
to
put everybody in jail.
That's right, exactly.
So,
because Democrats adopted it.
Democrats adopted it and grew the prison industrial.
And you think that Occupy sort of tease up this perfect political issue for Republicans in this election to sort of re-seize Nixon 68.
Well, that's right. And so, when Ann Coulter talks about demonic loons, what she's talking about is, her book that came out, Demonic, which is about sort of mob tactics, the mob mentality. And so conservatives since Edmund Burke have been concerned about the mob taking control of politics. And when they see sort of large numbers of and they did.
Unless it's the Tea Party.
Billionaires, big banks, the Tea Party did not adopt mob tactics.
Oh, my God, really? That's another conversation.
That is a separate conversation. But I think that the reason why you're seeing this sort of get pushed into the mainstream Republican conversation from guys like Breitbart and others who, started out with raw video and just pushed the message of anarchy.
Well, no, they started out with edited video.
Right.
But there's a reason why that message was so effective for Nixon, and it was because the country itself was riven by social unrest, and you had kind of rising crime. This is happening still in a context of relative social peace. It's actually kind of astonishing that with economic, with economic conditions being what they are, that there has been so little genuine unrest. There's not a lot of crime. No surveys of voters' concerns put crime near the top of the list. And so this isn't kind of a crystallization of a larger free-floating anxiety, which I think is why it's not going to be quite as effective.
But what I do think,
I hope people go and see the Edgar Hoover movie, the Edgar J. Hoover movie, because the J. Edgar Hoover story that Clint Eastwood is telling right now reminds us that, even as Dr. King, the most nonviolent guy in the world, is receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, you have J. Edgar in the back room trying to smear the man. I mean, let's
because he was a lawbreaker. I mean, I think part of what
violence. He would never have got elected in any State of the Union because he had been cast as this terrible threat.
But if the point is that law itself is the thing that we value the most, and I would agree that the law and order question has been kind of a central tenet on the right, and the fact is that civil disobedience does require breaking the law. And going to jail and actually asking for it. I saw just the other day, I saw an image of Harriet Tubman described as a runaway slave. And I thought in order to do that, what you have to do is understand that her legal status as slave was the primary identity. And that, so she's always sort of this lawbreaker. Right. Well, now at this moment, we now look back and go, oh, well, obviously.
What a hero.
Right, she's a hero. But at any given moment, law itself is always up for social redefinition. Always.
Jesse Meyerson, who we've had on the program, who's been covering Occupy Wall Street, J.A. Meyerson, and had this tweet the other day. He said the fruit vendor in Tunisia, Bouzazi, who was arrested and lit himself on fire in protest and sparked the Tunisian revolt, was actually illegally selling fruit. He was arrested for breaking the law. He actually didn't have a license to sell the fruit, but no one now lingers on the illegality of his fruit selling. My story of the week, coming up next, an Up exclusive on a secret plan to attack Occupy Wall Street. Right after the break. My story of the week, an Up with Chris Hayes exclusive. Speaker Boehner's lobbying buddies are proposing a hit job on Occupy Wall Street. This week, here at Up, we obtained a memo written for the American Bankers Association that lays out a plan for a nearly $1 million campaign against Occupy Wall Street and any politicians who might express sympathy for Occupy Wall Street, including specific Democratic politicians in contested races. The memo was prepared by the Washington lobbying firm Clark, Lytle, Geduldig, and Cranford, or CLGC for short. Two of the partners at the firm are former aides to Speaker John Boehner, and the firm's website boasts of its closeness to the current speaker. Prepared as a pitch document for the American Bankers Association, a client of CLGC, the memo lays out the political threat Occupy Wall Street poses for the banks and their sworn defenders in the Republican Party. Democratic victories in 2012, the authors write, would mean more than just short-term political discomfort for Wall Street firms. It has the potential to have very long-lasting political, policy, and financial impacts on the companies in the center of the bullseye. So here we have, in black and white, former Boehner aides who now lobby for Wall Street, admitting Democrats will be tougher on Wall Street, and they also admit that Occupy Wall Street and emboldened Democrats might push Republicans to distance themselves from Wall Street's bigger firms. The bigger concern, in the words of the memo's authors, quote, should be that Republicans will no longer defend Wall Street companies. In order to head off this terrifying eventuality, the memo proposes a program of opposition research on Occupy Wall Street activists, which, quote, will also identify opportunities to construct fact-based negative narratives of the OWS for high-impact media placement to expose the backers. They admit that individual companies under threat by OWS and its adoption by Democrats likely will not be the best spokespeople for their own cause because, well, everyone hates the bankers. So the former Boehner aides who now lobby for Wall Street sketch out a strategy of deploying proxies to shill for Wall Street and against Occupy without the public knowing. The former Boehner aides also urge big banks to punish politicians who target them early on in order to send a message. Quote, a big challenge is to demonstrate that these companies still have political strength and that making them a political target will carry a severe political cost. And they say that a strong media placement early in a transition to adopt the OWS movement will send a powerful signal about the risks of carrying that through. One goal of this campaign, the former Boehner aides turned Wall Street lobbyists write, is to, quote, provide cover for political figures who defend the industry. They are proposing a campaign using Wall Street money to defend Wall Street's political allies and specifically targeting Democratic politicians for re-election who might stand up to Wall Street. naming Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown and identifying Senate races in Florida, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Wisconsin, and New Mexico for targeting as well. It was always clear that if Occupy Wall Street began to have some success, it would precipitate a massive backlash from the powers that be. And now we've seen this week, as I said, the Empire Strike Back. We placed a call to Clark, Lytle, Geduldig, and Cranford to ask them about the memo, and they did not respond. The American Bankers Association told us, quote, "Our government relations staff did receive the proposal. It was unsolicited, and we chose not to act on it in any way." Nevertheless, what's contained in this short memo are all of the most craven, corrupt, and insidious forces of the status quo coming together to squash Occupy. In fact, the document represents just about everything wrong with America in 4 short pages. We have a lobbying firm whose webpage glowingly advertises that Sam Geduldig, a former Boehner staffer, quote, knows how to kill legislative threats to his clients, drawing up a battle plan for the financial industry and its 1% members to use their deep pockets to attack the Occupy movement and protect the bank's financial interests by creating, quote, political cover for bank-friendly policies. And while doing this, they would, of course, have the help and connections of fellow partner Jay Cranford, who just a few short months ago was working as a policy aide to Speaker Boehner. Here's the thing to consider. This is the most important point. This is just one memo from one firm that we just happened to get our hands on. Think for a moment of how many similar documents are floating around out there, how much money and power is being amassed to make sure that Occupy Wall Street is just a brief fad, a quirky cultural moment we'll all vaguely recall years hence. That's if the 1% get their way. We'll post the memo on our website, up.msnbc.com, after the program's over. I'll be talking about this story on Weekends with Alex Witt right after the program. And on Up tomorrow, Senator Sherrod Brown joins us to respond to the plan. My guests will weigh in on this story right after this. Michael Steele responding to the Geduldig memo that we just broke here on Up. He says, quite cleverly, my understanding is that President Obama is the single largest recipient of donations from Wall Street, but this is a political question, not a policy question, so you'll have to take it up with the RNC. Melissa, you have a reaction to the memo?
Only, I suppose, that you frame it as like this is all the most evil, horrible things possible, and maybe, but it's also true that just as much as we were talking about protest is about disrupting the status quo. I mean, you got to expect the status quo to try to protect itself.
Right, yes.
And in fact, one of the things I was having a conversation with a colleague about yesterday is, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do we shift the public opinion of those who are part of the 99%. At the same time that we're saying the 99% is terribly disempowered. So I guess for me, part of what would be interesting is to ask, how do we shift the incentives for the 1%?
Yeah.
How do we make the incentive structure different? And typically we've used the tax code to do that, right? But there must be some way to... So I guess, in other words, I'm a little less outraged and appalled than I am sort of feeling like, well, this is what it means to control the resources of power.
What I think is the fascinating thing about that memo is that for anybody who kind of has doubts about whether the Occupy Wall Street movement is effective, as I've had from time to time, I kind of keep going back and forth on it. That seems about as kind of dispositive and a statement of the fact that this movement is really accomplishing something. I mean, I think that
it's an amazing statement of priorities, though. I mean, this is an industry facing complete collapse, they suggest. We need to save this entire sector, and they're going to pay less than $1 million?
Right. Well, this is just one firm trying to drum up some business, I should add.
So clearly your last point was really the important one, is this is an incompetent pitch, and just imagine the
if a good one came.
Really going through.
Right.
Here's what's interesting to me about this is what's the fear that's expressed in the memo? The fear is that Occupy is going to hook up with the Tea Party and it's going to be sort of game over for the establishment. Right. And I think that points to, one, yes, that Occupy is making a dent in sort of public understanding of what's going on in politics these days, also shaking up the people at the top. But specifically in this context where they say, it's not just about sort of the radical left seizing the moment, it's about the radical left and the radical right sitting down with each other and saying, well, wait a minute, is there something we can rethink here? And so, when you rhapsodize about slogans like, this is a global uprising, I don't think that's a winning message with the American people. I do think that when you look at something like Occupy Memphis, I believe, where the Tea Partiers basically said, "Hey guys, let's have coffee."
Together.
They sat down. They actually had their own be your own town hall. Right? There's a great idea, and it actually worked. And I think if that starts happening across the country, if that kind of arrangement becomes popular and catches on, then the fears expressed in that memo might very well come true.
And I think I should point out that this lobbying firm lobbied heavily for TARP, right? Which is the bill, which is the sort of point, I think, of the most intense point of intersection between the grievances that both of these sides share, and that most sort of pits the kind of establishment and the Beltway against sort of popular sentiment.
Well, how likely do you think that is? I mean, that Memphis story that came out this week was pretty interesting, and I think simply having made the overture got a lot of points on both sides. Clearly, there are some cultural differences, but the fears, but the fears expressed in this memo, I think, are real at that level. And I'm just curious what you think in terms of the likelihood of any kind of partnership ever being brokered success.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's an important question. I think I'm going to go out on a limb and say there might be important regional differences here. Yeah. You're not going to see this happen in Oakland.
Right.
You're not going to see this happen on the sort of Eastern Power Corridor.
Right.
If you're going to see it happen, it's going to happen in the midsection of the country, I think.
We're going to talk more about this right after this break. All right, we are back here with James Polis, Michelle Goldberg, Laura Flanders, and Melissa Harris-Perry. Ben Smith at Politico put up this graphic, I think a few other people have recently, to show the one way in which I think unquestionably Occupy Wall Street has been effective. And this speaks to why you have a Washington lobbying firm writing to the American Bankers Association saying we got to do something about this. This is appearances of the phrase income equality in news since September. Do we have that? There we go. Income inequality in the news, and there you see it. It's gone up about fivefold over the 2-month life of Occupy Wall Street, and I think this is a place where the agenda setting power of it is just indisputable and evident. And to me, what's so remarkable is when we were having this conversation, the Tea Party was amazingly effective in completely centering the national conversation on government being too big, deficit, cuts. Completely effective. And we are living with that effectiveness in the body of the super committee. The conversation has shifted now, but there's a weird moment we're in which the conversation we're having is about income inequality and jobs, and the machinery of policy.
But this is the point, because this is the place where the Tea Party beats Occupy Wall Street. It just is the one place, and that is they ran candidates for office and won and went to Washington. And we are now, my bet is, it's just a hypothesis, that if you were to map that same graph against deficit reduction, that it would be going down just as the conversation.
In fact, that graph exists, and you are correct.
Yeah, very good.
Okay.
So good on that. But the fact is that super committee is still in there talking about deficit reduction, not income inequality. So yes, we have to reset the agenda, but where the Tea Party just got it right, where we haven't yet, and I know, all parties are corrupt and the system is broken, but they ran for office.
Well, a lot of the Occupy people are people who got entirely behind the Barack Obama campaign, and now they're looking at a president who has come out in favor of Social Security reform and Medicare reform, and has not lived up to their dreams. So I don't think it precludes. I don't think it precludes that they may do it again. I just think the idea that these are not people that have ever engaged in electoral politics.
Oh, no, I'm not saying that they've never engaged. I'm saying that
what do they do now?
I think this is such a pathology on the left, the kind of their quickness to despair of electoral politics. I mean, yes, Barack Obama has failed to create a kind of Scandinavian welfare state in less than 3 years, but
I don't think was the goal.
Well, no. That's what I would personally like to see. But what's amazing to me is having written a lot about the right. The right, when they didn't get their way, starting in the 70s, they did it very systematically, took over the Republican Party from the grassroots, and eventually got presidents who were responsive to them because they are the roots of the party. Time and again with Democrats, you see these kind of very intense mobilizations for presidential campaigns, and then a kind of complete throwing your hands up in despair when a single president fails to change
but I don't
the
think
system. And finally, if you really do believe that Wall Street power is as entrenched as I think a lot of us do believe, then you also cannot think that a single president in a single election can undo it.
But look at Ohio and Wisconsin. These people are not only active at the federal level, they're also active at the local level, and that's where they're going next, I think.
We've seen in both those states channeling from protest to electoral politics. I think it's a big open question about if electoral politics is an agenda next. They've announced a Occupy Congress movement that's going to happen in December. I want to talk about some of this with Anita Dunn, who is a top advisor at the Obama campaign, and she will join us after this break.